2 days before Christmas, Seminary South Shopping Center in Fort Worth was exactly what a mall is supposed to be. Bright lights, crowded aisles, people rushing with gift bags and holiday lists. It was the kind of public place where you feel protected by the sheer number of strangers around you. And that's why what happened on December 23, 1974 still feels wrong, because 3 girls walked into that normal noise, and the noise never gave them back. 17-year-old Mary Rachel Trlica drove to the mall with 14-year-old Lisa Renee Wilson and 9-year-old Julie Ann Moseley, who joined at the last minute after begging to come along. Hours later, their Oldsmobile would be found in the Sears upper parking lot, locked, with purchases still inside, like a paused scene that forgot to unpause. No crash, no warning, no obvious mess, just the car sitting there, holding the evidence that they planned to go home. Then the next day, a letter arrived that complicated everything, a message that claimed they had to get away, that they were going to Houston, and that they would be back in about a week. Quick question, which clue do you think matters more in this case, the letter or the parking lot? Comment one word, letter or lot. And if you like calm, timeline-first mysteries with the missing details left in, subscribe, because this channel is built for cases that still don't have an ending. The day starts with routines, and routines matter because they tell you what a disappearance is not. Rachel is 17, newly married, and already living in that strange in-between stage where adults expect you to act grown, but the world still sees you as a kid who should come home on time. She has a car big enough to feel like adulthood, a 1972 Oldsmobile 98, the kind of vehicle that sits heavy and calm in a parking lot, like it belongs to someone steady. Renee is 14, and her whole day has a natural deadline because she has a Christmas party later and she wants time to get ready. That detail might sound small, but it's a psychological anchor, because when a teenager has a plan they care about, they don't usually vanish into the night without saying anything. Julie is 9, and that changes everything immediately, because 9-year-olds don't run away in the way older teens can. They don't make secret travel plans, they don't coordinate disappearances, and they don't silently leave a public place without an adult controlling the moment. Julie also wasn't supposed to be there. That's one of the most important human details in the case, because it makes the day feel unplanned in the most normal way, not secretive, not suspicious, just life. Renee's boyfriend, Terry Moseley, was originally meant to go along, but he backed out, and Julie begged to take his place. She called her mother at work, pleaded, pushed, and her mother finally agreed with one condition: be home by early evening. This is the kind of agreement families make every day without thinking, because the world is supposed to be safe enough that a mall trip before Christmas doesn't feel like risk. But in missing cases, these ordinary permissions turn into permanent timestamps, because once the deadline passes, the story transforms from late into wrong. Before Seminary South, the girls made a stop that becomes one of the few solid anchors investigators can actually touch. They went to an Army-Navy surplus store because Renee had items on layaway, and layaway is one of those old-school details that quietly proves normal life. It means you planned to return. It means you expected tomorrow. It means you were still living inside the calendar like everyone else. Renee picked up 2 pairs of jeans, and that specific purchase later becomes important because it shows the day is moving step by step, not like a sudden escape. In cases where people vanish, any confirmed step is gold because it tells you the story didn't begin with chaos. It began with errands. Then they drove to Seminary South Shopping Center. And if you picture a mall in 1974, 2 days before Christmas, you can feel why this case is so unsettling. It would have been full, packed with families, teenagers, employees, people in a hurry, people carrying bags, people paying attention to their lists and not to strangers. The atmosphere is bright, noisy, and busy in a way that should make it hard for anything terrible to happen unnoticed. And yet that environment has a darker side because crowds create camouflage. In a crowd, you can be seen by 100 people and remembered by none. You can walk past witnesses and still be invisible because nobody is watching for a crime. They're watching for sales, for exits, for the next store. Inside the mall, witnesses later said they believed they saw the trio, which suggests the girls arrived safely and were moving normally. But the sightings never turn into a clean chain that walks you from store to the parking lot. The case doesn't give you a final confirmed store, a final confirmed purchase time, a final confirmed conversation. It gives you a general truth, they were there, and then it hands you the blank. And that blank is what makes the disappearance feel like a trap door, because trapdoors don't leave messy footprints. They leave a sudden absence in a place where presence should have been guaranteed. This is the part of the story where time becomes a weapon. Renee has a party later. Julie has a promised return time. And because Julie is 9, that return time isn't flexible the way it might be for teens. As afternoon turns into evening, the people waiting at home start doing the normal mental math. Maybe they stopped for food, maybe they ran into someone, maybe the mall was crowded, maybe traffic was bad, but those explanations only work for so long. There's a moment in every missing case where the brain flips from casual concern to alarm, and it usually happens when the simplest person to locate can't be located. A child, a teen with a schedule, a person who should be easy to reach. By around 6 p.m., Renee's father and a neighbor went looking, and they found Rachel's Oldsmobile in the Sears upper parking lot at Seminary South. And this is where the case tightens into something terrifyingly specific, because a car is not a rumor, it's a fact you can photograph, it's a fixed point in space. The vehicle was locked, and inside were shopping bags and gifts, proof that the day progressed far enough for them to buy things, proof that at some point they returned to the car. That one detail is a micro-reveal that changes the whole story because it pushes the disappearance closer to the end of the errand. They weren't taken on the way to the mall, they weren't lost before arriving. They were likely interrupted at the moment people usually relax, the moment you're done, the moment you're walking back to the car and thinking about home. And the car didn't look dramatic. It wasn't smashed up. It wasn't left with a note on the windshield. It wasn't parked in some strange far corner that screams abandoned. It was simply sitting there like the girls would be back in 5 minutes, like they stepped away for a quick question, a quick detour, a quick conversation. That's why this car becomes so haunting. In true crime, we're trained to look for violence, but sometimes the most chilling evidence is calmness, because calmness suggests control. If something happened to them near that lot, it may have happened in a way that prevented panic from becoming noise. This is where the psychology of public place disappearances matters. If someone approached them in the parking lot, the easiest way to succeed is to avoid looking like a criminal. You don't drag someone screaming through a holiday crowd. You don't create a scene that pulls eyes toward you. You create a moment that looks like routine. A short conversation, a request, a problem to solve. And the most effective tool for that is either authority or familiarity, because both can make people cooperate for 30 seconds before their brains realize they should run. Authority doesn't have to be real to work. A confident voice, an official tone, a uniform, even the suggestion of security can shift behavior instantly, especially in a mall environment where security presence is normal. Familiarity can do the same thing, because if you recognize someone, your guard drops, and your instinct becomes polite instead of defensive. And when you have 3 girls together, including a child, the moment an adult steps into the interaction, the power balance tilts fast. Julie doesn't have to be convinced by the stranger, she only has to follow the older girls. Renee doesn't have to be convinced, she only has to believe Rachel knows what's happening. Rachel doesn't have to believe it's dangerous, she only has to believe it's temporary. That's why the gifts inside the car hit so hard. Gifts mean intention. Gifts mean they were still living inside the normal world where you buy things for people who are waiting for you. Gifts mean they weren't packing to leave. They were still shopping for Christmas. Families searched the mall. They waited. And this part is quietly brutal because it shows how the human mind clings to the last known location as if proximity can solve it. Renee's father and others stayed at the mall into the night, hoping the girls would return to the car, because a car is where a day ends. People come back to their cars. People don't just abandon them. And in those hours, you can imagine the families scanning every group of shoppers, every doorway, every exit, because the mall is a machine that keeps producing people. They kept expecting the mall to produce their girls too. But night turned into morning, and the car stayed where it was, locked, holding gifts and silence. Then the next day, the case received something that sounded like an explanation, but behaved like a trap, a letter. It was sent to Rachel's husband, written in a formal tone, and it claimed they had to get away, that they were going to Houston, and that they would be back in about a week. It also pointed directly to the car's location in the Sears upper lot, as if the writer wanted the car found while still guiding everyone's attention toward a runaway narrative. This is the second major micro-reveal because the letter doesn't just add information, it changes the direction of urgency. It tells the world to interpret disappearance as choice, not force. And here's why that matters more than people realize. In the first 24 hours, your greatest weapon is speed. Malls change shift by shift. Parking lots refill. Employees forget faces. Witnesses move on. If an offender took them, the offender's greatest advantage is time, and a runaway narrative is how you buy time without anyone fighting you for it. A mall disappearance is terrifying for one simple reason. It doesn't feel like it should be possible. Not because malls are magic, but because malls are systems, cameras, employees, rules, crowds, schedules. Yet the more you think about it, the more you realize a mall can also be the perfect place to vanish, because it creates the illusion of safety while encouraging one behavior that predators love: autopilot. People walk faster, they look down at bags and lists, they focus on doors and escalators and the next door, not on faces. So when you imagine the final stretch of that day, you have to imagine it the way it likely felt to them, not the way it looks in hindsight. They had already completed errands, they had already bought things, their car was waiting. In their minds, the hard part of the day was over, and that's exactly when people lower their guard. The moment you're done is the moment you stop scanning. If they returned to the Oldsmobile with bags, that suggests a very specific scene. The three of them moving across the lot. A 9-year-old staying close because parking lots are where adults naturally tighten their grip, not out of fear, but out of habit. A teenager balancing shopping bags and thinking about what comes next: food, home, a party, getting ready, the future still normal. And Rachel with keys, maybe thinking about traffic, maybe thinking about her husband, maybe thinking about Christmas. Now add the kind of interruption that can happen in a parking lot without looking like a crime. Someone approaches and says there's a problem, a minor collision, a complaint, an issue with the vehicle, a lost item, a question. The reason this works is because it sounds like the mall itself is talking to you, and most people assume more problems have more solutions. You don't think danger, you think annoying and quick, and let's solve this and leave. If the person looks like they belong there, security, employee, someone who speaks with confidence, it gets even easier. A confident tone compresses time. It makes you feel like you're late and you should cooperate. It also keeps your voice down because when someone sounds official, you don't want to be the dramatic person in public. You don't want to cause a scene. That instinct to stay calm, to stay polite, is not weakness. It's training. And it's exactly how a public removal can happen without screams. And once you get 3 people to shift even a few steps away from their car, the entire geometry changes. The car stops being escape. The car stops being boundary. The moment they step away from the driver's door, the offender is no longer racing the ignition, they're racing attention. That's a different race because attention is slow. Attention takes a moment to form. Most bystanders need a clear signal to recognize danger, and a calm conversation isn't a clear signal. This is also why the child matters so much. Julie doesn't have to be convinced by a stranger directly, she only has to follow the older girls. A child will mirror adult behavior, and if the older girls aren't panicking yet, the child won't either. That creates a quiet chain. The offender controls the first person, and the other two move because the first person moves. And in a parking lot full of movement, 3 people walking isn't suspicious. It's the most normal thing in the world. Now imagine the moment where normal flips. That flip can happen with one object, a weapon shown, not fired, just displayed, or one sentence spoken in a lower voice, or one hand placed in a way that changes meaning. And in that moment, the victims face a brutal decision: comply and stay quiet, or resist and risk the child being harmed first. People don't like to say that out loud, but it's one of the strongest reasons a group can be controlled without screaming. When a child is present, the instinct is protection, and protection often looks like silence. That's why the locked car with gifts inside feels like calmness, but it's actually a sign of speed. Whatever happened likely happened fast enough that there was no time for normal decisions like put the bags in the trunk, sit down, start the engine, drive. Something interrupted the last 10 minutes of the day before they could complete the last 10 minutes. And once they're moved away from the car, you're dealing with the hardest kind of missing case. A removal, not a struggle. A transition, not a scene. A crime designed to happen in the space between that looks normal and that was danger, a space so short that most witnesses never even realize they were looking at it. The letter is the moment this case stops being only a disappearance and starts becoming a story about control. Because once a missing person case comes with an explanation, even a suspicious one, it changes how everyone moves in the first days. It arrived the day after the girls vanished, addressed to Rachel's husband, and it didn't read like a frantic note from someone young and scared. It read like something written to manage the situation. The message said they had to get away, that they were going to Houston, that they would be back in about a week, and it pointed directly to the location of the car in the Sears upper lot. That last part is important because it means the writer wasn't just communicating, they were guiding, making sure the car would be found, while also telling everyone how to interpret the absence. And the way it was addressed mattered too. It used Rachel's husband's formal name, not a personal nickname, not a warm line that says "I'm okay," not the kind of message you expect from a teenager who is supposedly leaving voluntarily. Families notice that cold distance instantly because families know how their people sound. Even small physical details about the note became part of the debate. Details like the envelope being written in pencil while the note itself was written in ink. That doesn't prove a forgery, but it creates friction because it suggests the note and the envelope might not have been written in one smooth, emotional moment. It feels assembled, and in a case where evidence is thin, anything that feels assembled becomes suspicious. The bigger issue is what the letter does to time. In missing cases, the first story becomes the first response, and the first response shapes everything that follows. If investigators treat the case as a runaway situation, the urgency drops, and in a mall disappearance, urgency is your only weapon. A shopping center is a living machine. Employees rotate, security shifts change, crowds refill the lot, and memories fade faster than people think. A witness only remembers what they mentally label as important, and on December 23, 1974, most people were labeling one thing only: Christmas. So if the public didn't know to watch for 3 missing girls, then the moment that mattered could have passed in front of 100 eyes without anyone filing it as a crime moment. This is why the car's presence is so eerie when you place it next to the letter. The Oldsmobile was found locked with gifts inside, meaning the girls either returned to it after shopping or someone else returned to it as part of staging. Either way, the car becomes a frozen point, a last physical fact you can't argue with, and the letter tries to turn that fact into a neat narrative, as if the disappearance is simply a choice, as if they decided to leave and thought, we'll just abandon the car, we'll leave the gifts, we'll be back soon. That story struggles to breathe for one reason that keeps slamming into every theory. Julie is 9 years old. 9-year-olds don't agree to vanish for a week. 9-year-olds don't decide Houston is the plan. 9-year-olds don't silently cooperate with a runaway script unless an older person is controlling the entire moment. So the letter doesn't just raise questions about handwriting, it raises a bigger question about realism. If the girls left voluntarily, who convinced a child to disappear with them, and why would they do it 2 days before Christmas with gifts already purchased? The letter asks you to accept a kind of behavior that doesn't match the human texture of the group. So if you lean away from voluntary disappearance, the letter begins to look like misdirection. Not an emotional message, but a tool. Not a tool to explain where the girls are, but a tool to shape what people do next. Because if you can make police and the public believe runaway, you create a delay. And delay is the most valuable thing an offender can steal. In that sense, the letter is not just evidence, it's strategy, a small piece of paper that can buy a head start without anyone realizing they're handing it over. Now, once you see the letter as strategy, you start noticing how perfectly it fits the setting. A mall parking lot abduction is a high-risk moment for an offender because malls are public and public places produce witnesses. So the offender's goal wouldn't be brute force, it would be compliance and speed. The ability to move 3 girls without creating the kind of scene that pulls attention. And this is where the case begins to pull people into the same mechanism again and again: social control. In public spaces, the fastest way to control someone is not always physical, it's psychological. A confident voice, a believable role, a request that sounds official, a moment that looks like an ordinary interaction instead of violence. Think about how many normal reasons exist for 3 girls to pause near a car. Someone says they hit the car, someone says the car's lights were left on, someone says there was a complaint, someone says security needs to speak with you, someone says your little sister is in trouble. Any one of those sentences can freeze a person long enough to step away from the driver's door. And in a crowd, if you can keep the first 10 seconds calm, the next 10 seconds can become control. That's why authority is such a powerful theme in public disappearances, because authority makes people cooperate before they evaluate risk. This is also why later witness fragments, even when they don't lock into proof, keep haunting the case. There were accounts that someone saw 3 girls being forced toward a vehicle, including a yellow pickup, but those stories never became the clean, verified testimony investigators needed, and some witnesses could not later be located. Another type of account described a person being forced into a van and the moment being waved off as a family dispute, a phrase that can shut down intervention because it turns a stranger's concern into hesitation. And years later, a different claim surfaced that the girls may have been seen with a security guard on the night they vanished, which is the most chilling version of compliance because a uniform can move people through a public space without triggering alarm. Even without deciding which of those fragments is true, the pattern they suggest is consistent. The disappearance likely didn't look like a fight. The car was left behind. The gifts remained inside. There was no famous scene that shoppers reported, no loud struggle that became instant legend. If something happened, it happened inside a narrow window where it either looked normal or it happened in a quiet corner where the crowd didn't translate it into danger quickly enough. And then time begins doing what time always does to a place like a mall. Store employees go home, shifts rotate, holidays end, The lot fills and empties thousands of times. Even if an employee noticed a strange interaction, that memory has to compete with hundreds of ordinary interactions. That's why mall disappearances are so brutal. Not because there are no people, but because there are too many people, and too few of them know they're supposed to be witnesses. So the case starts to live in a painful in-between. The biggest clue is a letter that won't confess its author. The biggest physical fact is a car that offers no direction. The strongest mechanism is compliance, but compliance doesn't leave dramatic evidence. And the longer the case stays unresolved, the more it pressures everyone involved to fill the blank with something, a suspect, a theory, a story that makes the silence feel less impossible. That's when suspicion begins to spread outward in the way it always does when there's no confirmed after. People start asking who knew their schedule, who knew their relationships, who could influence where they went, who had access to their lives in ways strangers wouldn't. But suspicion is not the same as proof. Without a confirmed location after Seminary South, without a confirmed vehicle connected to the girls, without a confirmed witness who can place them with a specific person, suspicion remains a shadow you can point at but never hold. And while all of those debates continue, the case keeps returning to the same hard image, the one image that refuses to fade. A locked Oldsmobile in the Sears upper lot, gifts still inside, sitting in a place full of people as if the day ended normally, while the girls disappeared into a story that still hasn't given the world a single verified step beyond that parking lot. After that, the case lives inside a tug-of-war between two realities. One reality is physical, the car, the gifts, the timeline, the fact that 3 people were there and then weren't. The other reality is narrative, the story the letter tries to force onto the case. And the reason narrative matters is because narrative controls response. People don't search for abduction the same way they search for runaway. They don't interview the same people. They don't seal the same areas. They don't treat the same details as urgent. A runaway story makes everyone wait. It makes the public shrug for a day. It makes a mall employee forget the strange interaction they saw because it didn't register as danger at the time. It makes security guards stop thinking about that one moment in the lot that felt slightly off. And the offender doesn't need the world to stop searching forever. They only need the world to stop searching for long enough. That's why the letter's tone is such a big deal. It's not the words alone, it's the emotional temperature. A real voluntary note usually leaks personality. It uses a private name. It sounds like the writer. It has a messiness to it because people don't write perfectly when they're upset. This letter feels like it's trying to be functional, like it's trying to land a message rather than share a feeling. It's closer to a script than a confession. And then there's the destination choice, Houston. It's far enough to suggest travel, but familiar enough to sound plausible. It's a city you can say without needing a detailed plan. It's also a place big enough to swallow someone in the imagination. That's what makes it a useful word if your goal is misdirection, because it gives the mind a map without giving investigators a real address. But the biggest problem with the runaway angle is the child. Julie is the anchor that pulls the whole story back toward control. A 9-year-old doesn't stay missing for a week as part of a teenage decision. A 9-year-old doesn't quietly accept we had to get away without asking to go home. A 9-year-old doesn't choose to vanish right before Christmas, which means if the letter is true at all, it's only true in the way a forced message can be true. Words created under pressure to buy time. And this is where the case becomes emotionally brutal, because every family member can feel the difference between a message that comforts and a message that manipulates. Comfort tries to reduce panic. Manipulation tries to delay action. This letter reduces panic, but not by easing fear, by steering interpretation. It tells you what to believe before you've even had time to think. So investigators are left trying to solve something with two missing pieces at once. The first missing piece is the girls. The second missing piece is the moment. The moment is what every case needs, the confirmed last frame. Who did they speak to last? Where exactly were they walking? Did they load the gifts? Did they open the car? Did anyone see a vehicle stop? Did anyone hear raised voices? Did any employee see an uncomfortable interaction and dismiss it as a family argument or a normal dispute? In a busy mall setting, the offender's best friend is ambiguity. If you can make your crime look like a disagreement, you can make witnesses hesitate. If you can make your crime look like normal movement, you can make witnesses forget. And if you can add a letter that says they left willingly, you can make witnesses talk themselves out of what they saw. That's the darkest use of social psychology. It doesn't just hide the act, it changes the memory of the act. Now, when you zoom out, you start seeing why the case attracts so many almost sightings. Public disappearances create phantom certainty. People remember a child. People remember a coat. People remember a vehicle. And when the news spreads, the brain begins rewriting old impressions into new meaning. Someone becomes sure they saw them. Someone becomes sure they heard something. Someone becomes sure they saw a forced movement. The problem is, certainty doesn't equal accuracy, and accuracy is what investigations need. That's why the most valuable information in a case like this is not the dramatic tip. It's the boring, specific tip. A license plate, a uniform description, a vehicle parked in a strange place at a strange time, a person who asked an employee an odd question, a security guard walking with 3 girls if that happened, because a uniform can act like permission. These are the details that don't feel like true crime when they occur. They feel like nothing, and then later they become everything. The case also teaches a hard lesson about crowds. People think crowds create safety, but crowds mainly create deniability. In a crowd, everyone assumes someone else is paying attention. In a crowd, everyone assumes authority is real because the environment contains authority. In a crowd, people comply faster because they want to exit the awkward moment and return to their lives. That's why a parking lot can be more dangerous than a dark alley. A dark alley makes you alert. A parking lot makes you routine. Once the letter entered the story, the case stopped behaving like a clean search and started behaving like a maze because every new lead had to fight the same problem. The girls had left almost nothing behind except absence. Police had a locked car, gifts inside, and a message on paper telling everyone not to panic yet. And that combination can slow the kind of aggressive early response that missing cases need. The families didn't buy the runaway explanation, not for a second, because it didn't match the people they knew, and it especially didn't match a 9-year-old being carried into a getaway plan. So they did what families do when the official story doesn't feel real. They widened the search themselves, pushing flyers, calling papers, pressing for attention, trying to keep the case from sliding into the cold category of no new updates. And as tips started coming in, they came in the way tips usually come in for a public place disappearance, scattered and imperfect. One early claim said someone saw the girls in the record department of a store inside the mall shortly before they vanished, and the detail that haunted investigators wasn't only the sighting, it was the idea that another person may have been with them. That's the kind of detail that changes the temperature, because it suggests the trio may not have been alone at the end, and if they weren't alone, then the final minutes might have been social before they were dangerous. Around the same time, items were found elsewhere and checked, and that pattern became the rhythm of the case. A lead appears, hope spikes, comparisons are made, and then the lead collapses into not them, leaving everyone back at the same parking lot. The families eventually hired a private investigator, and that decision tells you how quickly desperation can become strategy. The investigator, John Swaim, dug into the kind of angles police don't always have the time to chase deeply, and one of the strangest discoveries involved obscene phone calls being made to young women who had submitted job applications, including a connection to a store where Rachel had applied. The detail matters not because it solves anything, but because it introduces a predator who used access to personal information to target women, which is exactly the kind of behavior that makes a family's skin crawl when their loved one disappears. And yet even that lead didn't become the doorway to the truth, because suspicious behavior isn't the same thing as proof of abduction, and this case never gave the proof. Then the investigation entered its most brutal era, the era of searches driven by tips that are too specific to ignore and too weak to trust. At one point, Swaim led volunteers to Port Lavaca after a claim that the girls had been killed and taken there, and when people show up with shovels and flashlights and manpower, you can feel how badly they want the world to give them something solid. They searched under bridges, the kind of place people imagine truth gets hidden, but they found nothing. Later, when skeletons were discovered in another case, comparisons were made against records, and that hope collapsed too, because the remains didn't match. Over and over, the case did the same cruel thing. It offered something physical, then took it away again. And then there's a detail that almost feels like a curse in the story, because it's so final and so human. Swaim died only a few years later, and reports say he ordered his files on the case destroyed. Whether that decision came from darkness, pain, or some private reason nobody can fully interpret, the impact is the same. A collection of leads, notes, names, and investigative threads disappeared forever. In a long mystery, files are memory, and when memory burns, the case doesn't just lose paper, it loses direction, it loses momentum, it loses the ability to recheck old paths with new eyes. As decades passed, the case did what unsolved disappearances always do. It became a story people returned to because it felt like it shouldn't be possible. A mall disappearance is supposed to leave witnesses, or at least a confirmed last moment, and this one never produced that clean last frame. Then, in January 2001, the case was reopened and assigned to a homicide detective, and the tone shifted more firmly toward the idea that the girls likely left with someone they trusted, and that more than one person may have been involved. That's a chilling conclusion because it doesn't point to a masked stranger sprinting through a parking lot. It points to a controlled exit, the kind where the victims don't scream because they believe they're still inside a normal interaction for the first few seconds. Years later, the search even went underwater. In 2018, volunteer divers and family members helped raise cars from Benbrook Lake because of a theory that something connected to the case could be down there. It's one of the most emotionally heavy kinds of searching because water feels like a place where answers can sleep for decades, sealed away from time. But the recoveries didn't deliver the missing ending people wanted, and the lake didn't give up a confession. The case returned again to what it always returns to: a locked Oldsmobile, Christmas gifts inside, and the paper letter that may have been written to buy time while the real story disappeared. The reason this case still grips people is because it leaves you with the same two forces pulling in opposite directions. On one side, you have normal life, a child begging to go, teens shopping before a party, layaway jeans, holiday crowds, and gift bags sitting in a car. On the other side, you have the shape of something organized, a letter that tries to steer the narrative, witness fragments that hint at quick control, and a disappearance so clean it feels like someone planned to leave as little as possible behind. And in the middle is the part that won't resolve, the moment at the edge of the Sears lot when the days stopped being ordinary and became a gap that 50 years still haven't closed.